And we are live here on the Fantrax YouTube and X pages, eventually on the P2W Fantasy Podcast. My name is Nick Script, NFL content lead for Fantrax, talking Week 4 fantasy football. Each week I dive into every single matchup and I identify players that have a plus matchup, guys that can take off for fantasy football, that can take off for DFS purposes. I pride myself in that article every week, and I pride myself in this specific podcast every single week because I do think that it can give you an edge in your leagues or give you an edge in your competition. It's been a very complicated week for myself, just to be honest here. The house was hit with COVID, and I thought, I was going to be the one that dodged it. My son got sick, the baby was sick, and then I'm over here saying I'm built different, and I'm not. It actually kicked my ass pretty bad. So if I'm coughing at all, or if I'm wheezing like I just did right there, that's the reason why. So hopefully I'm on the last day or so. I split time with my one daughter, and I haven't been able to see her finally get to tomorrow. So I'm thankful for that. It's just been a rough week, but the grind don't stop, especially when it comes to fantasy football, which is a big escape for me. Yes, it's a side job. It's a hustle, but it's something that is an escape. It's something that helps my, everyday process. Actually, it's a way for me to kind of have peace of mind. So I love this shit. Like I don't just do it to do it. I don't just do it because it's a job. I love this stuff, and I especially help you guys, or I love helping you guys win. The intention always has been to help you guys play to win, and I mean that shit. Like I'm very passionate about it. It's something that I take a lot of pride in. So gear up. We're about to get going with this week's matchup winners to help you guys get an edge.
Play to win, no fear to give. I feel, but I can't forgive. I go all in this time, yeah, I won't regret. I'll pick the best on trip, they don't understand. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win, oh, play to win. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win.
All right, so each week I look at every matchup. I look at the yards allowed, the fantasy points per game allowed. It's something that I really enjoy doing. And, it helps from just simply looking at each matchup. I kind of hit or miss, at times, but that's kind of what happens with making these calls. But it's my most educated guess at the end of the day, right? It's looking at numbers, it's looking at data, and it's looking at the matchups. So last week, some guys that I hit on, Sam Darnold, Chris Olave, Chuba Hubbard, Derrick Henry, Rashee Rice, Khalil Shakir, Jamar Chase, just calling his bounce back game. Bucky Irving, Austin Eckler, Jalen Tolbert. There's a lot of injuries popping up right now. I keep seeing guys, out of nowhere are popping up on the injury report. So there's a lot to pay attention to. So hopefully I skip over some of those in this specific podcast here. But Saints-Falcons. So the Falcons allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season, which could mean another, viable Derek Carr streaming week. Chris Olave is now questionable. He got hurt at practice. That could change things. If you take away Chris Olave, I know he wasn't exactly, balling out the first 2 weeks while Derek Carr was, but I think it does change things when the coverage, alters to, focusing on Shaheed and focusing on Kamara out of the backfield. I know he's been banged up as well. But if guys are healthy, I think Carr could be a streamer this week. I think it's a matchup that could, see some decent passing volume on both sides if they can keep this one competitive. Because I know the first 2 games for the Saints were not competitive. Carr did score over 21 fantasy points in both of his opening weeks. And after a kind of down week 3, I think the matchup itself could be one that, turns into him again being a streamer, but it's kind of dependent on who's going to be missing there. So keep an eye on that. Kyle Pitts, other side of the ball. Kyle Pitts scored a touchdown in week 1 and finished with a season high 59 yards in week 3, but he has yet to flash to the extent we are expecting him to with Kirk Cousins. I believe in week 4, it'll be his first big game. Pitts earned a season-high 5 targets last week, and that number can go up against the Saints, who have scored the second most points this year. The Saints' offense has been rolling, so the Falcons are going to have to match that. The Saints allowed the 5th most fantasy points per game to tight ends and the 8th most passing yards this season, which sets up Cousins to Pitts, that connection, to have a nice week. Bengals versus the Panthers. So Zach Moss is coming off of his best game of the season, rushing for 58 yards and a touchdown, paired with catching 5 balls for 39 yards, 20.7 fantasy points. The Panthers matchup will support Moss staying hot for fantasy football. They allowed the 5th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 5th most rushing yards this season. The Bengals have struggled this year as a team, and Andy Dalton, he's elevated the Panthers just last week, but I do think this game script could be in the favor of Moss getting plenty of touches. I think the Bengals can handle the Panthers, even with their struggles and even with Dalton looking like, the best quarterback in the league last week. I do think that Moss will see the volume that will support him to have another good week. Last week, 17 touches, I think was an encouraging sign of things to come for week 4. The Panthers offense, they took a step forward with Andy Dalton last week, which was very clear when you look at the numbers just across the board, what Bryce Young did the first 2 weeks and what Andy Dalton did in 1 week. And the person that was elevated the most was Deontay Johnson. For perspective, Bryce Young threw 245 yards with 0 touchdowns and 3 interceptions through 2 weeks. And Andy Dalton came out and threw for over 300 yards and, a couple touchdowns. Deontay Johnson, I think, pending his health, I know he's questionable right now too. I think he's a safe play with Andy Dalton. I think that, you can count on volume and you can count on just competency with Andy Dalton. So 12 targets, 5 catches, 34 yards and no touchdowns for a total of 8.4 fantasy points the first 2 weeks. Last week, 14 targets, 122 yards, touchdown, 26.2 fantasy points. Big difference there. Rams versus the Bears. Kyren Williams has scored 5 total touchdowns this season, which has made up for some major inefficiencies in the opening weeks. Williams had one of his best games, or the best game of the season, in week 3, rushing 24 times for 89 yards. He caught 2 balls for 27 yards, scored 3 total touchdowns, 31.6 fantasy points. That's the expectation of Kyren Williams that, we had coming into the season. The Rams are a depleted core right now. No Cooper Kupp, no Puka Nacua. So I think attacking Chicago with Kyren just makes sense, especially coming off of a hot week for him. The Bears allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season, but most importantly, they just allowed Jonathan Taylor to rush for 110 yards and 2 touchdowns last week. Good week for Kyren Williams yet again. The Rams allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks and the 4th most passing yards this season. Although the Bears lost in week 3, which hurts as a fan, I think Caleb Williams flashed his profile plenty. He threw 33 for 52, 363 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. He did throw 2 interceptions and he fumbled. So, he scored 17.32 fantasy points. That could have been a much better day if he didn't turn over the ball. But I think it's a good sign for him to be productive through the air in week 3, especially seeing, he wasn't the opening 2 weeks. 93 yards, no touchdowns the first week. 174 yards, no touchdowns the second week. So the week 3 box score itself could be an encouraging sign of better things to come for Caleb Williams. The Rams are a great matchup for him to have another big day through the air. And I think, his week 2 rushing total of 44 yards also shows something that was in his prospect profile, that he can have some dual threat ability. So I think it could be a breakout performance this week for Caleb Williams in week 4 against the Rams. Vikings versus Packers. I'm going to scream Aaron Jones revenge game. Jones opened up the season rushing 14 times for 94 yards and a touchdown. He caught 2 passes for 15 yards, and he scored 18.9 fantasy points. Then he had a down week 2, but in week 3, 19 rushing attempts for 102 yards, caught 5 passes for 46 yards and a touchdown for 25.8 fantasy points. Encouraging is in 2 of those games, those rushing totals, right? 94 and 102. Also encouraging is that he's caught 10 balls across the last 2 weeks. So we're seeing that dual threat, bag that Aaron Jones does have. And I think against his former team that he spent, his entire career with, that the focus is going to be get Aaron Jones the ball. Because you know what? Last week, he was a major piece of them getting that dub, the Vikings. They're having a great season, and I think he's a part of, a big part of that. So give him the ball in week 4 against the Packers. and hopefully he runs all over his former team. Reports have indicated that Jordan Love should play in week 3. He had that knee injury reports indicated, I'm sorry, I backtracked that. Reports indicated that Jordan Love could have played in week 3. So it's encouraging to hear that in week 4 because it likely means he's good to go. And who's the biggest beneficiary of Jordan Love playing? Jayden Reed, whose ceiling, I think, has been limited the last 2 weeks with Malik Willis. He opened up the season with that monster game, scoring 33.1 fantasy points. He caught 4 balls for 138 yards and a touchdown, and he had that 33-yard rushing touchdown. Reed is the most versatile wide receiver on the roster. He's utilized, on the ground, 33 and a touchdown week 1, 37 week 2, 19 week 3 rushing yards. He's also earned 6 targets in 2 out of 3 appearances. He leads Green Bay in targets. He's clearly the wide receiver 1, whether people to this point want to admit it or not. The Vikings rank 13th in fantasy points per game allowed to wide receivers and 7th in passing yards allowed this season. So Jordan Love, if he's back, I love Jayden Reed this week. Jaguars versus the Texans. I will continue to push Brian Thomas Jr. to be a flex option. The first-round rookie scored a touchdown and drew a PI in the end zone week 1. He finished with 94 yards in week 2. Then he earned a season-high 9 targets in week 3. So I see 3 different positive signs out of their first-round rookie. Trevor Lawrence has desperately needed an upside wide receiver, and that is what Brian Thomas Jr. is. The Texans allow the 11th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season, and T-Law is going to have, he's going to have to chuck the ball plenty against the Texans offense and C.J. Stroud this week. Other side of the ball, the Jaguars allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks and have allowed the 3rd most passing yards this season, which sets up C.J. Stroud for a nice week. As a rookie last year against the Jaguars, Stroud scored 20.6 and 30.9 fantasy points in his 2 matchups, passing for 280 and 2 touchdowns in week 3, then 304 and 2 touchdowns in week 12. Stroud has totaled 709 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and 24 rushing yards so far this season, which has been pretty disappointing for fantasy, in all honesty. But I think week 4, I know no Tank Dell this week, but I think week 4 could be a big day. He's just had success against them last season, and also the Jaguars are a good matchup for quarterbacks this year. So C.J. Stroud this week. Steelers versus the Colts. So the Colts allowed Cole Kmet to catch 10 balls for 97 yards and a touchdown in week 3 after not facing any above average tight end in the 2 weeks prior. Pat Freiermuth has yet to have a huge fantasy week, but he's consistently been involved in the Steelers offense so far this season. Muth ranks 2nd on the team in both targets and receptions with 13 and 12 and could be lined up for a solid week 4. It's also encouraging that Justin Fields is coming off of season highs in passing attempts with 32, completions with 25, completion percentage with 78.1%, and passing yards with 245. So the Colts got ate up by Cole Kmet last week. Good. Pat Freiermuth has a sticky role in the team. Good. Justin Fields is coming off of a solid passing week. Good. I like Pat Freiermuth this week. Broncos versus the Jets. So the Broncos allowed the 11th most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season. And after a big week for Tyler Conklin, I think he could be looked at as a streamer this week. Conklin caught 5 of his 6 targets for 93 yards in week 3 for 14.3 fantasy points. Aaron Rodgers is still building connections in New York. He didn't play in 2023. He played a whole 30 seconds before he was out for the year. So he's still building connections. Conklin has been the epitome of a consistent target earner the last 3 seasons because prior to this year, he has earned 87 targets on the dot 3 years in a row. I think he earned Aaron Rodgers' trust last week. I think he's a streamer this week. Eagles versus the Buccaneers. Saquon Barkley is an obvious fantasy football start each week, but I think this week he could be worth waging on for DFS and player props. Especially given this Tampa Bay matchup, they allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 8th most rushing yards this season. A.J. Brown, likely out. I think Devonta Smith was just ruled out. So that even further emphasizes getting the ball into Barkley's hands. Barkley currently ranks 1st in rushing yards with 351, which is 27 more than any other running back. He's tied for first in rushing touchdowns with 4. He's tied for 8th in receptions with 10, and he scored the most fantasy points so far this year. I said it on my X page, but I don't think there is anybody else in the fantasy football world that I would rather roster rest of season over Saquon Barkley. I think he's that impactful for fantasy football. Let's talk about the Commanders versus the Cardinals. Jaden Daniels has now scored 28-ish fantasy points in 2 out of 3 of his games played this season. The rookie is an elite fantasy football asset, and there's no debating it. And that's evident by him scoring the second most fantasy points so far this season. Daniels' rushing abilities were heaviest of tied to his prospect profile. And 171 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns speaks to that so far in his NFL career. What was not credited, though, enough was Daniels' profile through the air. He had a very nice profile through the air at LSU. His passing yards have progressed in 3 weeks, 184 to 226 to 254 through the 3 weeks. And he's coming off of a game where he threw for 2 touchdowns and no interceptions yet on the year. The Cardinals allowed the 11th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season, which further emphasized Daniels being in your starting lineup as a must start. Marvin Harrison Jr., pending health, is set to have a massive week 4 against the Commanders team that has allowed the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the second most passing yards this season. I think Trey McBride's going to miss this week. Marvin Harrison Jr. has been dealing with a quads issue, something obviously to monitor up until the game time there. But week 2, Harrison had that fantasy breakout, catching 4 passes for 130 yards and 2 touchdowns for 29 fantasy points. Scored again in week 3, but most significant was 11 targets last week. That's what we're looking for, right? This is a matchup. Again, Harrison could score 20-plus fantasy points in. Little side note here. Sometimes it's not always about digging only into matchups. Sometimes it's about giving you, an edge. Drake May finished his college career with 8,018 passing yards, 63 passing touchdowns, 1,209 rushing yards, and 16 rushing touchdowns, which is why he drew that third overall draft capital in 2024. May you saw action last week in the Patriots game. It was the first time he stepped on the field. And I think he's a guy that eventually can turn into a fantasy football weekly starter for teams. I don't know about this season, but he does have dual threat upside. He does. It's in his profile. I think he's worth stashing. I think that there's a chance that after this 49ers game, pending the Patriots lose, that he could be starting. I'm not sure if he's going to start at the very end of the season, if he's going to start next week. Does he start at halftime this week? I'm not sure, but I think if you have the roster space in redraft, he's worth stashing. The Patriots allowed the 9th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 6th most passing yards this season. After 3 weeks of terrible Brandon Ayuk fantasy production, I'm going to say this is the week. 10 targets last week is a green flag despite the lack of production. This man put up 1,342 receiving yards last season. He was paid. He's due to produce. Missing offseason time because of the contract situation, I think, has impacted his first 3 weeks. And I feel like this could be a get-right game for fantasy football, especially seeing that it's a banged-up San Francisco core. I don't know if we're going to bank on Juwan Jennings, balling out and breaking fantasy football weekly. I would bank on Brandon Ayuk bouncing back for fantasy football this week. Sorry, I was struggling, trying to get through this. Still kind of sick. Browns versus the Raiders. The Raiders allowed the 10th most passing yards this season and the 12th most fantasy points per game, which is not an elite quarterback matchup, but I do think that Deshaun Watson could be a good streamer this week. Week 3, he threw for 196. Not, elites, but it's showing progression through the air. Watson's 85 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown this season so far flashes what he's done in the past. Last year, he finishes a top 10 fantasy quarterback in 3 out of 5 of his full games. So it was just last year that he was productive. I think, I'm not going to say he's going to be massively productive, but I do think the Raiders are a decent matchup if you're looking for a quarterback to stream Watson this week. So Adams was just ruled out, which is very interesting. The Browns allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. It's a matchup that I think, somebody's going to take off in. If I had a bank on anybody, it's probably Brock Bowers. Jacoby Myers would be the next name people think about. I want to plug Trey Tucker, though, the sophomore here. Last week, he played 81% of the snaps, season high. He earned 9 targets, season high. He caught 7 of them, obviously a season high as well, for 96 yards, a season high, and a touchdown. This is a field-stretching wide receiver that saw volume and produced with volume just last week. So seeing that Devontae Adams is out, that's a lot of volume up for grabs. Deeper leagues, take a look at Trey Tucker. Bills versus the Ravens. The Ravens allowed the second most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season, which supports Dalton Kincaid trending up, who had season highs in various categories last week. Kincaid caught 3 of his 5 targets for 41 receiving yards and a touchdown, 13.1 fantasy points. Josh Allen threw a season-high 30 passing attempts, which resulted in season highs in receiving yards and passing yards and touchdowns last week. I'm sorry. Mixing things up. So Josh Allen last week, season-high 30 passing attempts, season highs in passing yards, passing touchdowns, 263 and 4. This is the type of matchup against a good Ravens team that I think Allen's going to have to throw the ball 30-plus times again. And seeing that it's a good matchup for tight ends, I like Dalton Kincaid this week. Derrick Henry was in my matchups article and podcast last week. He's probably a guy you can bank on every week to score a touchdown at this point. I think the Bills matchup is one he can stay hot in. 151 yards and 2 touchdowns last week. Obviously a very good week. The Bills allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. And after the Ravens abandoned the pass last week, if they can keep this one tight or take a lead, they might do the same thing. I don't know if that's going to be like the norm, but I think Derrick Henry in a good matchup versus the Bills is going to see good volume again. He had 26 touches last week. That's encouraging because it ended up being, a W for them. So big spike week for fantasy, 30.4 fantasy points. Derrick Henry staying hot week 4. Let's talk Monday Night Football just briefly here. The Dolphins allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs this season, which could mean a bounce back week for Tony Pollard. Pollard opened up the season with 18.4 and 15.2 fantasy points. In weeks, he displayed some rushing and some receiving upside. Miami is a good matchup for him to get back to double-digit fantasy points. Don't know what's going on with their quarterback situation. Could get ugly. Not in the sense that the Titans are going to beat them by 20 or something, but the quarterback play could be iffy. So I think the running back for the Titans could have a good matchup here. Let's talk about that Seahawks versus Lions game. The Lions allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season, which means you should fire up DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith-Njigba in your lineups this week. DK has finished with 129 and then 104 receiving yards and a touchdown in each of his last 2 games with over 20 fantasy points. JSN was MIA last week, but he caught 12 of 16 targets for 117 yards in week 2, which shows upside in flexing the sophomore in this Lions matchup. I think there's going to be a lot of offense in this Lions matchup. DK is a must start weekly for the rest of the season. I like JSN this week. All right, that'll do it. Enough ranting for me. I think there's some comments in here. Should I sell Stephon Diggs at high in fantasy? I don't know. It's always dependent on what you can get for a guy. I think people are always looking for the end result. What can I get for this guy? Should I do this? Depends on your team makeup. If you're on a dynasty team, this is a dynasty team, you're a contender. You don't have a deep wide receiver core. Should I sell Stephon Diggs high? I'm 3-0. I don't have a lot of wide receivers. No. Should I sell him high? I'm a rebuilding team in dynasty. He just had a good week. Yes. I mean, there's a lot of context that comes with stuff like this. So it's not really knocking your question at all here, but if it's a redraft dynasty, what's your build? What's your depth? Who else do you have? What can you get him for? I'd say if you're ever looking to sell, sometimes, you can actively seek to trade who could use Stephon Diggs. Go to that team. What do you like from that team? Send that, trade offer over. Sometimes you can make it a bidding war. Hey, Stephon Diggs is on the block. I'm looking for this, something brief. I'm looking to fill my running back 2 slot, whatever. Just a lot of context in fantasy football. Best of luck this week, though. That's going to be it for me. Made it through this podcast without coughing or anything like that. But a lot of content this week, a lot of content the rest of the season. So make sure you are following, subscribe, whatever, to wherever you're seeing this. Appreciate you guys.